have Pat Moore going to talk about the 200 years of the brick church. Other than the town itself, it is the only institution that's been in existence that long and still operating and still having their original building at Orange here. And I'm going to turn over to Pat in a moment, but first I will announce next month we have Nick Stromolson, who's going to talk about his great-great-grandfather, Nicholas Powers, the famed bridge builder from Clarendon. And Pat, all yours.
I'm glad to hear that that's going to be coming up because he's one of the people I'll be mentioning in the history of the church. Probably a lot of you have had experiences moving into homes that another generation has already lived in. And every time you go to open a closet and clean out the back part of it, you find gems from decades ago. Or the attic, you go up in the attic. Sometimes it can get a bit overwhelming. What do you do with these things? They seem trivial at the time, but when you realize how old they are, you want to save them. The same is true of a church. A church, the brick church, is not just a building, it's a family. It's a family of people who have a like goal. In this case, the family's goal is to honor God and to do deeds that would make Him proud of us. So that's probably as highly theological as I'll get, because I know it's a mixed group. But our family at the brick church has an attic, and it has a storeroom with file cabinets. And going through all the file cabinets, well, most of the file cabinets, as many as I could, became overwhelming to me. I'm not one who remembers dates anymore. I'm not one who's any good with names anymore. So if I miss your names, don't be offended. It's just the brain is full. So instead of telling this as a history lesson, I'd like to tell this as a family story. Because my family goes back to the very beginnings of this church. In fact, my family goes back to the early settlers. I'm going to focus on the first person that comes up on this. That's your cue. We haven't arranged our cues yet. The first person that comes up is not the most beautiful woman in the world, but she's very dear to me. In fact, at one point when my children were little, I moved her picture from the main hallway into the back hallway so it wouldn't frighten them because they were afraid the mean lady was going to be haunting the house. This is Alzina Button Smith. Alzina was the daughter of Frederick Button, who you may know from all of the agricultural success he had and the books he put out and the agricultural society that he founded, and the state fair has a blank picture frame because we can't find a picture of him, but he was the founder of the state fair. So she had a very busy father. She also had an extremely busy, hardworking grandfather. He was Charles Button, who owned a good portion of the land in Wallingford in this area. Of course, it wasn't called either of those names then. But these were the type of men who raised little Alzina. So I want you to, other than seeing this picture here, I want you to think of her as you might think of your own grandmother. What was it like when they were younger? Who would they have known? Who would they admire? And I kind of followed her life and beyond to tell the history of the church. And I forgot to flip my page, so we can go on to the next picture. Because we don't have pictures of her father, this is Frederick Button, who is remembered by our church as one of the early founders. He was one of the first 10 families that signed on to the original. Name of the church was the Second Religious Society in Clarendon. The first being a Baptist church that is located on Walker Mountain Road. Go to the first hill north of there, and on the east side of the road, that's where the original log cabin for the first town meeting hall built by the Baptist church was. The farmers around were not necessarily all Baptists. That church didn't take off real well, but it was kept open for meetings of the town, open for private meetings, other things like that. So that's going to be where our story starts. At that time, Alzina was 7 years old. Now, think of yourself as a 7-year-old with busy fathers and grandfathers, always seeming grumbly and gruff. Certainly Charles must have been by the time he had a 7-year-old grandchild. do your role, do what you're supposed to do. On the other hand, they were also very religious. They were farmers who appreciated the fact that God had given this amazing valley to them. Yes, it was tough, but it was a wonderful gift as they started to succeed, which by Alzheimer's generation of childhood, her father had succeeded in turning it into a working farm quite well. But something was missing in their life. They needed companionship, support, inspiration, and just a joining of other people around them, as all of us do. So, they're maybe out in the field, maybe at night for coffee, maybe on the weekends for picnics. People would get together to farm in this valley. There were people, all the names that you would recognize, and you'll see several of them up here, that were successful farmers in this Durham County. They met in the Little Baptist Meeting Hall to decide on a different type of church, one that would accept Presbyterians, Episcopals, Evangelicals, a whole variety of beliefs, and they would join together in commonhood of trying to seek God's will and praise it, just for bounty. Now, one of Frederick's best friends was Nathaniel Crary, and that's the next picture, I believe. He also has a window in the church, and both of these windows are honoring these men because they were the original founders among the 10, but these were the ones who were elected to be deacons. Deacons are people in the church who normally serve the physical needs of a group. That means buildings. If anybody needs repairs, needs help with building things, they're the ones that you go to. Go to the deacon to get help in that kind of thing. And when you first form a church, as was formed in 1822, boy, lost 100 years there, 1822, they had the first thing on the agenda after coming up to what their beliefs were that are packed up there, starting to fall off. But their beliefs were basically up there, and they had 10 people to start it. The deacons were given the task of how do we build a meeting house of our own that will honor God? How do we pay for that building? So they started, the deacons went out and canvassed the area to find out what the interest was. By the time the actual building was built, they had 50 people involved in this whole enterprise. 50 people, didn't all have money, because they were farmers, but they had wood, they had bricks, some of them were brick makers. Donations in the logbook include lime, and $1,700 and some odd dollars went from people in actual cash. That's how they started this amazing building. Let's see, around the prairie. So that was the job of those two deacons. There was a third influence in their lives too. And I can just picture this little Alzina, who should be upstairs in bed, sitting there at the top of the spiral staircase that we have, listening to the voices. And this newcomer from New York was probably the one that she liked the best. He was 22 years old, all energy of a 20-year-old. He was a zealot. The original meaning of a zealot, I think, was him. From the way they described him, he was one of those evangelists who came to town and thumped on the Bible and said, "Praise God!" Now, that's the kind of guy who comes in and flirts with a little kid. He plays with them. And that was probably one of their favorite. But he just had a way with people. He brought peace. He brought hope to this little area. That person was Henry Hunter. Again, we don't have pictures of him, despite the fact that he was young. Nobody thought to take a picture of him by the time before he died or moved on. He was involved as the first pastor of the church. He just was a people person. He could guide people into directions. So Henry Hunter has a place there at the church too. Those three got started on it, and sure enough, within 2 years, next picture, we had a building. Look at the lovely building we have here. Rebuilding. This is land that was given by the families on either side. The names have all switched through the descendant line, but it was Clarendon and Hodges and Patterson and Ritchie, and it was it was all land that had been given up as a donation instead of the financial contributions that I was just telling you about. Notice the building is pretty much the same now as it was then, except for the top. There's like a wedding cake. I call it a wedding cake topper because it has 2 tiers and it's all open with hopes of having a bell up there. At the time that it opened, when Alzina was 10, 1824, Alzina was 10, there was no bell yet. But look at the beautiful structure that she was involved in. She would be one of the first people to walk through the doors there. There, next picture. This is a modern picture, but the front facade, this whole area that shows here, basically is the same except for the electrical work. We know that was not there. And maybe the railing, that wasn't there. In fact, we were known for the large front lawn we had. No sidewalks, no paths, no nothing. It was just a big lawn where they did all their entertaining. If the season allowed, and even when it didn't, they were outside doing dinners and things. But it had these grand double doors that are 8 feet high at the door, 10 feet high by the time you get the window added. They have these 2 windows, 4 more on each side and 3 on the back side that were put in, all matching. Where they came from, we don't know. Phil was mentioning the fact that most of the stuff at that point in the cycle of life, a lot of the things that were finer art came from England. I think more likely just because of how many windows there were, there probably was a place that did church art things, church windows, church structures. But that's speculation, that's just my opinion. As you can see, they're really pretty fancy for a little country place. Let's look a little closer at what's going on top up there, because that has not changed at all. Next picture. Sorry, that was up to you, not to me. Okay. Here's, we know that it was 1824, nicely carved little things set right into the brick. And then what I wanted to point out was the clock that's up there. Obviously, that's not a working clock. Never was and probably never will be. There's a significance to that. First of all, a working clock would have been a heck of a job to do in those days. It's always wrong, not much good. Basically, this was telling people what time the service was. And if you can see through the peeling paint and those types of things, you'll see that it says 10:46, not 11. The service was at 11. You don't go into church when the service starts. You get there 15 minutes early. Be polite, we'll say 14 minutes because people ignore things like the quarter hour. They immediately rush to the hour. This way, people knew you get there before quarter of, and you won't be disturbing anybody and the service can start on time. How many times do you go into a church service and everybody's still talking and the service starts 20 minutes late? We don't want that. They didn't want it then. They had other things to do. They had to go home and take care of their animals. No, not yet. Oh, okay, yeah, we'll say that.
Okay.
Picture, 10-year-old girl, very proud of her daddy. Her daddy's responsible for this big, big church. It's very pretty on the outside. You step in those double doors, and over to the cabinet on the right is a cabinet. The top shelf has this beautiful silver set for the communion. Now, in those days, the communion was always the first week of the month, and they kept it in between time out here in this cabinet. The room was 24 wide and 11 feet deep. So to have you come in and look to the right and see that cabinet is really impressive to see the silver shining. We're not sure what they had on the other 2 shelves then, but we know what they have now. Next one. On the bottom shelf now, there's this pile of things, which normally on a Sunday morning would be on a table, just as you'd enter, and it would be on the table to the left here. We happen to have one of those, thanks to Ed Condon. Anybody got a guess on what that is? You got it. Back then, spinning in the middle of the service was acceptable enough so that they bought a matching set, at least of a dozen. Later on, as a fundraiser, they sold some of them, which is how Ed's family came possession of it. But just picking it up, you kind of want to go like this. We're not sure who was in charge. I think the deacons were in charge of deciding who washed the spittoons. But you know darn well it's the women who cleaned it. Okay, anyway, then you would walk into the main sanctuary. Now this had to be a sight when you're 10, you're maybe this tall, and you walk in through the next set of doors into the sanctuary, and you look at a room that's 40 feet by 40 feet square, 9 pews running up the center and the sides, and then a pulpit at the far end, and on the top of the pulpit table, good, was this bottle. Now, 90% of eBay, 99% of any of the other sites for antiques didn't know what this bottle was. But I knew because there had been a label when I was a child you could read, and confirmed by Ed and Phyllis Chambers and a few other people that I know. This is what they used before microphones. They thought that by standing this in front of the minister, when he would speak out into that room, somehow it would reverberate through that and roll out and make a loud, clear voice. I don't think it did much, but hey, I didn't believe it until I found one of the noted auctioneers who had come across the information on these and was searching for them. So that is still today. Now the size of that, I can't tell from that other than by being at the doors, you can see it's large. It's 1.5 feet long. It's not a pure onion shape. It's only a foot deep. And then it's 1.5 feet tall. Out of a heavy green glass. If you did fill it with wine, thinking it was for communion, I don't see how you could ever lift it and then successfully pour it into a pitcher. I don't see that possible. So I think the auctioneer and my mother and grandmother and Mrs. Chambers and all the other people, I think they were right. This is what they thought of as a way to amplify the voice back in those days. So I did not bring that here. It's under lock and key. We're only going to open it next year when we put in our time capsule into that cabinet. And that took up the center shelf of the cabinet. Now, let's see. Alzina was probably baptized in this church because they didn't have a place to do baptisms before. They didn't have a formal church up until this church was, they didn't have a formal church area for ceremonies. So probably she was baptized in the church, definitely by the church people, probably by Henry Hunter, who later went off on missionary in Massachusetts. He turned Presbyterian and decided he needed to sow seeds of the Lord in a wild, unkept part of Massachusetts. Why? I don't know. But anyway, we still had ministers. Everything was fine. We went to the next one. And again, fundraising started again. This time the women helped. Women's Aid Society started way back trying to make general improvements. They had the big structure. They wanted something else. As I said, we had an empty cupola. So the next picture is of the bell. This came in 1869, so it was a substantial fundraiser that they had to. They had to pay off their building first, and then they had to earn money for the bell. This Alzina was 55 when this bell arrived. But before I go on to tell you about that, I want to just jump in the future just a little bit. When the bell came, it weighed 800 pounds. How do you get it here? You don't do your pickup truck, you don't have the horses draw it. You bring it by train. The railroad tracks that were by the town hall were in existence then, and the train came down, brought it down from Troy, New York, I think we said. I think that's what we decided, Troy, New York. Came in by train. Somehow they got it off the train and up the hill to the church, and amazing, somehow they got it up in that little cupola area. All of that came to $300. Sounds so simple now, doesn't it? $300 was a lot of money in those days. The other tradition that they started at that time, remember I told you they were real sticky about the idea of people not being late for the service. They said, get there 15 minutes early. Well, there was a tradition with the bell, a reason for the bell. They rung it 51 times. I know that because in roughly 2000, 2001, I asked the current bell ringer at the church why he was ringing it so long. He said, that's the tradition. We ring it 51 times, because if I'm not sleeping late, nobody else is. And that's how the tradition got started. I'm afraid right now we don't have people quite that zealous, and I'm sure the neighbors appreciate that. We do now have 2 bell ringers. One of them is a visitor from New Jersey who comes up every month. So when she comes up, the 2 Sundays she's up here, she rings the bell. She's 81 years old, and she climbs those stairs to the bell section and rings them for probably a dozen times, just enough so people know it's time to get to church. And she's always there before the service starts to give them warning. They can take off their dirty boots and come on. Oh, the other one, second bell ringer, I have to give him credit. Rick Wilbur, Sue Condon's husband. He's also, when Joe Holmes is not there, Rick Wilbur is there, and he comes over. He's one of our elders, and he comes over and does that for us. Okay, this bell, amazing little bell, went up there in a damaged area of that wedding cake arrangement. The top layer had been pretty well damaged because there had been a lot of windstorms and wild storms before that. And that light look to the cupola was exactly that. Didn't go well in Vermont because of the winds. So what they did was they placed the bell in there, they took the very top off and just put a flat, I don't know if they had plywood back then, probably not, but they boarded over the top of the bell so it would be safe. And that stayed that way for many years. Okay, I said Elzina was 55. What's happened in her life in those years? Want to go to the next picture? Oh, close up of the bell, just to verify that yes, it is. 1868 was when it was made, and it was up in the chapel by 1869. And that's the clacker. Phil had a question on that it looks like it's of a different metal than that. We speculate that the idea is you have to have a softer metal for the clacker than you do for the bell itself, the brass bell. Otherwise, it will damage it'll crack the bell when it's swinging. So that's why it appears to be. Speculation. Again, I can't confirm it. Now we can get back to Elzina's life. This is Elzina at 55, probably around the same time as the portrait was done. But this is with her family in that 40 some odd years since the last time I talked about her. She married Nathan Smith, and she had 5 boys, the oldest of which was Seneca Eugene Smith. Seneca plays an important part not only as the oldest one, but he's also my direct descendant, as opposed to the other 4 brothers. And we've had a couple more years, and we find that the next picture, this is Seneca Eugene. That would be Elzina's grandson. When she was 61 years old, she attended his wedding at the church. So we've got Elzina baptized, educated, and married at the church. And now we've got her son, baptized, educated, and he was married to Maddie Fuller Everest here. And we just happen to have, this picture was taken probably the same year as their wedding, but it's not their wedding picture. But we happen to have the hat that he was wearing and the spats that go along with etiquette point. Spats always came in a set with gloves, and they had to match. You didn't wear black spats and tan gloves. Just didn't do it. So we have the spats, but we don't have the gloves. They got worn out. We have some glasses, and we have a frame for the hat because that particular shape of hat is not easy to hold. So they had a wooden frame that expanded to fit tightly, and it would hold the shape of the hat. Enough about clothing. Let's get back to the church. They're still doing fundraisers. They're still needing repairs. So now we're moving up to 1881. Next picture. And this is pretty much what it looked like in 81, because remember I told you that bell had to, when they found that it had been damaged, they could afford the bell, but they couldn't afford anything to cover it back up again. Well, they built a steeple. And I'm glad you mentioned that this Strom Olson presentation will be coming up soon because it was his ancestor who built the steeple. Nicholas Powers was paid $668 to design and raise that structure up there. It replaced the damaged cupola so that everything was protected. The design itself was to lift the eye up to God. Also, it made better sense for the windstorms to have that shape, more weather tolerable. Just as a side point flashing into the future, the last time we had that changed was in 2004, so it lasted a pretty good long time, and I'll show you a picture of that happening a little later. The cost of it, as I say, was $668. The 2004-2005 project was $103,000, so big difference. We could get a closer look at that modern steeple that he put in there, and the very top of it, most steeples at the time had the traditional Roman crosses, or the rugged cross, or just the traditional Roman cross. And Nicholas was a progressive, modern architect. He liked to make a distinctive, keep up with the trends. And he had noticed something that was used over in France to be more fitting for a king, more fitting for a god who reigns over everything. So he decided to do something more fancy than just an old cross. So he stole a modified version of the fleur-de-lis, and you can see it up there at the top. It was said that service that they first celebrated the opening of the mounting of the new steeple, the closing hymn was "Lift High the Cross of Jesus," and I think that's what he did. 1881 was such a rousing year at the church, lots of spirit in the community, and the women, again, decided, well, instead of going fundraising, why don't we spread the news about the church, and maybe that will, people will be more generous with their offerings anyway. We won't have to do a fundraiser to get it. So in 1881, thank you, see, you're listening. Well, they are. 1881, this was a newspaper that was put out, printed by Tuttle Printers in Rutland, and it was advertising, very cutely advertising instead of beggingly advertising, the report of a meeting at the town hall that was going to be a bazaar, February 6, 1881, and come one, come all, I guess is the way you call it, they collected a grand total of $110 from that bazaar. It was quite a fine affair, they said. At least that's what the newspaper said, and this one too. Unfortunately, we can't find any other issues with this, so I don't think they found it that successful. It was a lot of work. So they didn't do that anymore. But the proceeds from whatever activities they did would be the next page. Here we are again at the windows. This is a full look at the windows. They are roughly 10 feet high, and each one contains the name of someone in the family who played an important part in the church history. And it was provided by the family members and friends of those people that were voted on to be on the windows. This one is, of course, Frederick Button again, my relative, so I get to put him first. And he and Deacon Crary were on either side of the pulpit. That was their way of the tribute that they gave to these deacons. Frederick, by the way, was a deacon for 51 years, so it was no small side hobby. This was his life. So the next window is for Deacon, that's what the DEA stands for, is Deacon Nathaniel Crary. And the next one, this is in memory of Henry Hodges, and you can see that each window has a different insignia at the top, a symbol of, biblical symbol of kinds. This is for the cross of Jesus, wearing the crown of the King, King Jesus. Next one is Mr. and Mrs. Silas Willis Hodges, another Hodges. As I say, I think the Hodges, we think, are one of the donors of the land, and that's why so many of them are recognized here. But I also found it interesting that women weren't forgotten. Amazing. The women were not forgotten. They did mention that it was Mrs. that was also being honored. Next one is, oh good, these are matching. Hannibal Hodges, again, a Mr. and Mrs. And the next one, Sabra Gaskill. I wasn't able to find out very much of anything about them, Joseph and Sabra, other than there was a couple that had donated both money, time, and energy to the place, to the church. And then Silas and Polly Bowen. Again, they didn't make a significant difference to the media, I guess you could call it that in those days. They did to our church. And I'm sorry that I was not able to find more about them. If I dug farther into the files, I'd probably be insane by now. So we just left it with knowing their names. And if any of you are related to any of these, let me know later and we can catch up on better details to put into the records. Okay, the next one is John Pierce, and that's the double piece up there at the top. And the next one, George Crossman. Now that's a familiar name because we know that the Crossmans in this generation have been pastors, very, very beloved pastors in this area. So that has been carried on. This little church planted seeds in children, and the children grew up and carried on the name. And the next one is Chester and Rhoda. My card's wrong. Kingsley. Wrote the wrong name on there. Kingsley. Short story about the Kingsleys. The Crarys. Remember I said the Crarys and the Buttons were close friends. The Crarys also had a daughter, similar age to Alzina, I'm not sure specifically, but similar age. The Crarys' daughter ended up going with the Kingsleys' son. And they got married, and as a wedding gift, the mill and the bridge and everything became the Kingsley Bridge, this Kingsley Mill over there. So that's kind of a neat little turnaround. To add to that, we now have a current pastor named Kingsley, William Kingsley. And when he first came to interview at this church, he knew nothing about the ties with Kingsleys. So he was quite surprised when the first person came up to him and said, "So are you related to the people who built the bridge?" And he had no clue what they meant, but they did take it as a confirmation. Maybe this is a place they should come back to. So he's going to look up in his genealogy and see if he's related to the people who have Kingsley Mill. This is how the church looked inside after the windows were installed. You can see that they are the stained glass on the side. Because of the sunshine, you can't see the pattern or anything. By the way, they're not lead stained glass the way you see in the Roman cathedrals or those other larger cathedrals. It was some kind of a painting on the glass or a film on the glass that they put on, because there does not appear to be those lead pieces that seem familiar in the large cathedrals. There's also this. I don't know if you caught it, but when I told you they had matching windows, 13 matching windows that were in the original building, what do you suppose was the 13th window? Well, apparently it was considered to be a mistake or a drawback, because as you can see, it's draped here. The window was taken out in 1881, we think. Well, we'll find out about that later. Because I thought this was the next picture was what, let's try the next picture and see if it's what I think. Yes, it is. There we go. There's the window, no longer there. It was bricked in. The window is now over in Strom Olson's barn. If you drive by, you can see the frame. I think the glass itself has been broken, but you can see the frame of a very fancy window, and that's the window. It went over there, and they just covered it over with a drape, and as you'll see later, they made some prettier paintings on it instead. Get rid of that card, it's in the way. They were so proud of this whole beautiful interior that they had, that they decided to have a celebration supper, honoring all of the people from the Revolution to the current time, which was 1882. They would come costumed, and they would invite the town to a dinner. Thank you. They would invite the town to a dinner. It was a big success. They had raised $80, but the fun part of it was they all had a wonderful dinner. They had artifacts supplied by the Spencer family of early settlers that they found in their closets, the way I find in mine. And they also had a demonstration of flax spinning flax, by Mrs. N.J. Smith, who was 60 years old, 68 years old, sorry, 68 years old, and she gave the demonstration of how to spin flax. It was quite fascinating. The newspaper, by this time we had a Herald in Rutland, and they covered the event, and they said that it was delightfully a Congregational Society event. The costumes were at times grotesque, sometimes comical. They were all from the Revolution to the present time. And the proceeds were expended for internal improvements of the walls of the Congregational Meeting House. It's kind of cool. Now I'm going to take a little break from that to go up to this, the opposite extreme from the windows. This is just an entry in pencil, it looks like, or tar or something. It's on the walls as you climb the stairs to go up to ring the bell. The attic above the narthex. The people who did the actual work, the sextons, the deacons assigned the work and sometimes did it, but the sextons apparently were the ones that maintained it and did the improvements, and they felt writing on the wall the dates of things would give you an idea of whether it needed remodeling. This one you can read pretty clearly. A lot of them you can't because the cracks distract you from important words. Let's move to the next one. This is how most of the walls up there look. You can hardly read. You can get as far as W.R. Curtis Sexton from May something to 19 something, 1911, I think it was later than that. And now here's Diane Ingalls. So it wasn't just the women who were involved in the maintenance up there, but they would leave little notes and dates on it of things that were done. I took Ed Congdon up there last week, and he had a blast because he had been raised in the church and apparently got into a little mischief sometimes. And he and a friend would climb up there in the attic. They didn't write on the walls, but they would climb in the attic, go up the ladder, get out on the roof of the church, and sit and watch people and laugh at them on the way out of church. And he got hollered at one time by one of the pastors, and never did it. Well, I'd like to say he never did it again, but I could see the smile on his face. Sure he did. Did it more than once. But let's move to the next one. Not all people were nice little tiny writers. Some of them got a little bit bold and proud of their work. July 8th. This name behind the heat duct that got put in later years is Steele. And then you can see Kilburn here. We're trying to decide whether that's 1882 or 1887 to 1897, or whether it's 1982. We don't know. We don't know who that is. Next one. But we do recognize who this one is. These are heat ducts. 1891. You can see a couple of C's there. Let's go one more. I went to the other side of the heat duct, and sure enough, this was Ed Congdon's Uncle John, J.B. Congdon. And that was August 23rd, what did we just say, 39? My memory's bad on dates, so I don't do that. But that was his uncle, and he was very pleased to see him, and started telling me stories about his uncle. Nice guy. Next one. This was a puzzle. Even Ed didn't quite know what this was. We had guesses. It's a puzzle. There were several of them, and this was the only one that you could really read anything about. They looked like a calendar. Actually, they look like the prison walls when people, in the old-time films, you see in the calendar that they check off how many days they're in. So we think it might have been people who did bell ringing, keeping track of how many weeks they rang the bells, how proud they were that they had done it for 50, 60 years, whatever, or weeks. That's the only thing we could come up with, but that's one of the mysteries we found up there. The other mystery was we'll move on to that. You don't even know the mystery. To keep up with all the improvements that were going on, we'll get back to the interior of the sanctuary. As we said, they were celebrating the windows, but then they went on and raised the money for interior instead of boring drapes over what used to be the window. They made this beautiful fresco, and look at all the trim along there too. This was probably an Easter service. I'm looking at all the flowers there and thinking it's probably an Easter celebration in 1882 of all of these wonderful remodeling things they did. We haven't mentioned anything about music. I've got a couple of samples of where music might have come from. Apparently Alzina learned to play piano. We had a big grand piano in the parlor when I was a child. It must have been something that she played. It was given to the Historical Society in Rutland, but we confirmed that it's been moved because they didn't have room there. It got moved to the library, so you can still see her piano. But she has a lot of the books, so it's possible she may have provided music in the early days of the church. I also found in my barn one of those small box reed organs that the traveling ministers would carry with them. So it's quite possible that since they couldn't, they had all these other improvements to make, they didn't want to spend money on an organ until 1889. Are you able to make that any larger? Hey, beautiful, good job. Yeah, magic. This is 1889, an SD organ out of Brattleboro, and it was quite an astounding thing for a little country church to have something that beautiful. As time went on, people don't appreciate beautiful things anymore. They were thinking of tossing it away and getting something modern, and instead, in 1950, they had it electrified so that you didn't have to push the pedals at the bottom anymore. It was an electric organ then. That lasted until about 2000 or so when people got tired of it. They switched back to a piano for a while. They didn't like that. So now we're using a keyboard. It's sad. This went out to the narthex just as a conversation piece. And eventually even that, it looked old enough so that the powers that be said that maybe it should just be put into storage, and that's where it is. This year, when they were fixing the back wall of our storage room, they fixed that, and they were looking at the organ. They said, maybe we could get it to work again. Sure enough, they did. It still works. This summer, someone played it. So that was good. We wanted them to bring it in, and they said, how would we move that back into the church? I don't know. How'd they get it there in the first place? I said. They didn't like that. Okay, so next picture. What's Alzina doing? Now let's see, she was 75 by the time the organ came, so I doubt she was playing it. She might have been, but I think there were other organists available at that time. And by 1898, she was 84 years old and died old age in Vermont. 84 was considered a good life. But that's not the end of the story. Obviously, I'm still talking. So that's not the end of the story. It didn't end, because remember I told you she had sons. She had 5 sons. And those sons, that son, they all had other children. Seneca Eugene, the one that we were talking about here, had a son, his oldest son. Ah, here we are. You are so good. Thank you. I kept forgetting. Okay, this is the oldest son, named sort of after his father. Instead of Seneca Eugene, he's Robert Seneca. So that's Robbie. The second oldest is Irwin back there. He was a farmer. Robbie went off to school. He had bigger things in life than farming to do. He was going down to Yale University. And he went off to school when he was not much older than this. This was taken the same year that Alzina died, so it was probably one of the receptions after her funeral. At the church, by the way. Irwin was the farmer in the family. He stayed on the farm as he grew older to support his family there. But farming was on a downslide, kind of like it's now. They just couldn't make enough money out of it. So the fact that Robert had gone off to school and had started a life down in Connecticut, that inspired next oldest son, Hervey, who was my grandfather. Hervey went down and started a general store in Hartford, Connecticut. And then when his little brother, Arthur, grew up, he knew his older brother had made a big success in Hartford, so he moved down there too. And the two of them ended up working for the Hartford Courant newspaper. And they both became editors there, and so they were earning money down there and sending it back to support the farm when the farm had a crisis and couldn't support itself. It would be as if the Bromley's kids had grown up and gone to another state and were sending money to help when Bromley's barn fell down, or helping when their milk tank was leaking. It's that same kind of thing. Poor Irwin was up here not doing well on the farm, and he needed the support of his brothers to keep the farm going. And they did. They kept it going for quite a while. Okay, so how's the church doing during this time when the farms are not doing well? Let's move to the next one. they were still having activities. After all, you can go out and celebrate 4th of July on the lawn of the church. And this is an undated picture, but judging from the skirts, the styles, and the hot air balloons that are up in the sky, we think it was a turn of the century. So give or take 10 years, either side of the change of century. They also found, next one, look, all those people there. This is the Rutland Association of Congregational Churches. At this time, they found that it was more beneficial to join one of the organized church denominations, such as the congregational churches, which obviously were kind of the dominant ones in this territory at the time, because there was the structure, the money, the teaching availability, and other advantages to having an organization that's larger than a little rural church. So they started using this as a conference place because it was a nice vacation, free place, friendly people, and this is one of the years that they had it. This was probably around 1902 or so, I think. We're not sure on the date on that one. So in response to that, the ladies said, hey, I think we could do another fundraiser, and we're going to put in a beautiful ceiling to match all the beauty on the walls. So this is our beautiful ceiling. It's a metal ceiling embossed with a beautiful design. I have to admit, that's not the old original picture, obviously, because we've got a camera in the corner. We now have cameras because with COVID, we ended up going online for our services. We were able to get a large percentage of our congregation to attend every week online. We had our pastor go in and film it ahead, our singers go in and film it separately so they weren't violating any of the quarantine restrictions. We were able to put together a service online. The pastor's wife used to give a children's sermon, and it was delightful. I love that. I hope she'll do it again now that we're through the pandemic. But anyway, that ceiling is still there, and you can see it had a little trouble trying to keep up with the peeling paint. So you can see white spots where someone did that. The current deacon, Kevin Mullen, had a 12-foot ladder and about 3-4 roof rakes taped together with a gadget on the top that had spray insulation foam. We pulled the string and it would spray the foam into the places where there was rust to cover it and stop the rust. And then he changed the top of the pole and put a paintbrush on there, dabbed it with paint, and ran it up with the ladder as a fulcrum, and that's how he painted those parts on the ceiling. Eventually we'll probably have a fundraiser to paint the ceiling again. However, right now we're more worried about the structure above the ceiling. It's starting to get mushy up there, so we need supports for those little beams. But we won't talk about that. However, if you're ever looking for a place to put your money, remember we're always looking for money. Now, next. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead a few years. We had kind of a, not even a kind of, a really bad time in the 20s and 30s. We couldn't keep a pastor for anything. The weather was horrible in the winter. The expense of being in the sanctuary was incredible with the heat bills. And we lost a couple of pastors. Some of them went to go into mission work overseas. It was more glamorous. Some of them just wouldn't come because we couldn't pay them full-time salary. We couldn't find someone to just come part-time. So we had a solution to that in 1935. It's Old Home Sunday Services. Those were started in 1935 in conjunction with a new program that Robert Seneca, the one that I was pointing to before as the oldest grandson, Robert Seneca now was the head of divinity school at Yale. And he decided on a curriculum. He and Henry Eddy came up with a plan that they could change the curriculum of the divinity school by the 3rd and 4th year students who had a summer break would come up and be pastors. They experimented with our church. It worked so well that they then started it in Connecticut and other areas, New Hampshire and here, so that the young people wouldn't just have to be out in the world cold. They would have an experience for a summer. And they were in charge of working with the deacons and the elders and the other committees in the church to put on a heck of a darn good summer. At one of their Old Home Sundays, where Robert came back as a guest speaker, 300 attended. I think the church only holds 250, but 300 people attended. anyone who'd ever come here, anyone who knew someone who came here. It was an exciting time for the church because they didn't have to close. They had seriously thought in 1934, sorry, I got my generation wrong. In 1934, they seriously thought of just closing it and calling it quits, like so many of the other churches had had to do. But having it open for just the summers when the weather was fine, they could have all sorts of activities. And we'll go to the next page because this is a picture of Robert Seneca as an adult. Let's see, yeah, okay. Robert Seneca as an adult started that program, and it worked successfully for over 40 years, long after he was alive. The setup was still there. Yale still had these internships that were offered for the summers. So we were able to keep our church without a pastor all through those years, and the spirit of the deacons, the spirit of the committee people, the spirit of the ladies' aid kept the church from closing completely. They still had a place to worship. They still had guidance among them. The elders were in charge of the spiritual education. The deacons were in charge of the building. So it was kept alive through that. And this is a tribute to Robert Smith when he died. He was only 59 when he died. So it certainly could have been the end of that program and the end of the church at that point, but it wasn't. He had inspired a lot of people. Many of the ministers, I have some pictures of many of them, I think it's on the far table. And they were inspired to go off and find their own, make their own churches after they finished. Many of them went overseas to mission trips for many years and then would come back as guest speakers. It was a highly successful program. Okay, next one. Probably some of you remember this. This is when our church became the quintessential symbol of the New England village. 1994. See, we moved through life pretty well. 1994, and this was the cover of the phone book one year, and it was the cover of Remark magazine. I don't think it was the same year, but similar. I have a little note on here to say, okay, ask anybody if they know of a man who would have been around in the 50s, 60s, 70s, named Bill Delphia. No, name didn't ring. With a name like that sounds like Philadelphia. I keep throwing that out every time I come here because this was a man who would come to our house to play the grand piano, play ragtime on it. He would drive a Model T Ford and he had a pet owl. So that's pretty odd and people wouldn't remember him, but I haven't found anybody who knows him. So we'll go on to the fact that yes, we were still alive and well even in 1994. We had another fundraiser then. And this next picture is Ed's mother, Ed Condon's mother, and this is Kathy Delan. Her husband had just finished working on a remodel of our fellowship hall where they have a beautiful kitchen and we can seat 150, I believe, at a time for sittings. We have strawberry festivals in there now and everything else. And those two are, once again, doing fundraiser festivals, and we're alive and well. Other activities they had were dinners for the veterans, a harvest festival. We have land that the Condons donated over behind the town hall, that we have a garden, a public garden. If any of you don't do your own gardening and want a place to go, we have one open for anyone in the community who wants to use that. And then at the end of the season, several times we've had enough of the harvest to have a harvest dinner. And it's usually free to the public, but I think it'll be a fundraiser from now on. Okay, we gotta wrap this up or you guys are gonna fall asleep on me. We've got this picture, once again, hate to be a fundraiser, but once again, we had a problem. And that was the steeple didn't hold up well to the weather. So they decided it had to be taken down and rebuilt. This one was rebuilt by the Southgate Construction Company, and it was 2004 that they started it. They took it off, they had to take the bell down again. They kept it ringing because it was on that nice little stand. And I think the next picture shows the bell being put back up there once they repeated it. You can see, once they finished it, you can see the fresh plywood up there in the encasing of the bell. And it made a big hit in the newspapers. It was quite an impression. Next one. Because the sight of that spire going up by a crane was something that looked great in the Rutland Herald. And we had a lot of response from people who were encouraging us to continue with the project. And the next one. And this is from 2005 when it was completed, so the work was done pretty quickly. And it's all back in place. You can see there's still a hole there where it hasn't been louvered in. That was part of the big problem before. The open structure of the tops allowed pigeons and other animals up there. And they found a lot of dead carcasses and rot that was brought because of those things. So that explains that, other than weather, that there were other reasons for needing the deterioration. Sorry. And, oh, I know, one more thing, sorry. I'll tell them, you don't have to go back for it. Oh, there we go. This church sign. You notice we no longer have a congregational church. They decided that they liked the idea of the independence of being able to decide their own philosophies, close to being congregational lines, but not being controlled by them. We still have people of several denominations that come into our church. Most of them are evangelical-minded. So they took off the congregation part. They also took off the word old. Times being what they are, the churches found they only had old people in the church. So they wanted to give a better, more welcoming presence to young people. So take off the old and just call it the brick church. We are building blocks for people's lives. And that's our image now. We're staying young. They also took out all the frilly paintings inside. And you can move to the sanctuary next and see that we have limited the background, let the windows speak for themselves and not be overpowered by the paintings. We have an area for musicians in the front instead of hidden in the back choir loft or anything. And we now have banners of inspiration. They changed it this week and I can't remember what it said. That's terrible. I must have been paying attention to the pastor instead. But this is the front of our sanctuary now. And the back has another thing that was new, and we all kind of looked at it because Vermonters hate change. We all weren't sure we liked it. But the more we've been in there, the more we've realized it's really been a wonderful change, and it's enlivened our church a lot. We have people who are excited now, not just about their troubles, their problems in this little area, but now they look to the rest of the world. We have missions, there's a whole stack of them over there. Can't move, my knees are locked. We have a whole page there of some of our mission groups that we work with. Thanks to Jim Hetzel, one of our members, he has started several missions over in India. In fact, that's where he is now, India. He's gone to Uganda and he's gone to Nepal. And he starts schools. Started out doing it for young women who were street women. In Uganda particularly, there was a huge problem with both AIDS and slaughter, genocide. A lot of orphans were left over from the things that happened in Uganda in the 70s. So he's gone over there and started schools where they can get a regular education, but he's made schools for sewing so that they can learn the art of tailoring, make beautiful dresses and sell them in the cities nearby. He started baking schools, again, for the rich people who are in the cities. They're able to go in and bring in cakes and cupcakes and other things. He's now opened another school just this month that's going to be for the men to learn technical skills such as plumbing and electricity and computer design, I think it is. Yeah. So we are still an active church. We're different than we were, but we have the same thing. We're trying to honor God, and that's what the family tie is. We hope to pass it on to each generation in the future. I'm currently on the worship team. I'm not as prominent as any of my other relatives in my role, but I'm there, and I love the Lord, and I want to show people that we have a good place to be. So I kept it short enough so that you can come up and look at the things that I didn't cover because I knew my talking was starting to get boring. Oh, you can only take in so much. So please, come up, take a look at some of the things here. This blue stick is not an artifact, so I'll take that. But help yourself, and thank you for being so quiet and listening. I have a lot to say.
Thank you.